Welcome to the 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the world of cognitive distortions. You know those pesky mental traps?
Yeah.
The ones that really kind of mess with your perception of reality,
Yeah.
especially in social situations, I find.
Yeah. It's like having one of those funhouse mirrors,
Hmm.
in your mind,
Right.
distorting how you see yourself and the world around you.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is that these distortions are so common.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I bet most of us have experienced them at some point without even really realizing it.
Absolutely. It's not about, being flawed or broken or anything like that.
Right.
It's about understanding these patterns so we can start to kind of challenge them.
Okay, so let's start unmasking these distortions.
Yeah.
What's the first one that we should kind of be aware of?
Well, let's start with emotional reasoning. This is when you kind of let your feelings dictate your reality.
Okay.
So if you're feeling anxious, you might automatically assume that something bad is going to happen, even if there's no real evidence to support that.
Oh, I know that one
Yeah.
all too well. It's like those times when I feel awkward in a social situation,
Yeah.
and then I just automatically assume that, like, everyone else is judging me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that actually brings us to another distortion that's very common, which is called jumping to conclusions,
Okay.
which that has two sneaky variations.
Oh, okay.
So we've got mind reading and fortune telling.
Mind reading, fortune telling. Okay, those sound a little dramatic. Break those down for me.
Yeah. So with mind reading, you assume you know what others are thinking, right?
Uh-huh.
But without any real basis for it.
Okay.
Like, let's say someone doesn't text you back right away.
Right.
You might jump to the conclusion, oh, they're ignoring me or they don't like me.
Ouch.
Right.
Yeah, I've definitely fallen into that trap before.
Yeah.
So is fortune telling just like mind reading, but about the future?
It's very similar in that you're making these assumptions without real evidence. But with fortune telling, you're convinced that something bad is going to happen.
Right.
Like predicting you'll completely mess up a presentation at work, before you've even started.
Oh, yeah. So it's like setting yourself up for failure before you've even given yourself a chance to succeed.
And then we have all or nothing thinking,
Okay.
which is also known as black and white thinking. This is when you see things in extremes, no middle ground.
Okay. So either I'm a social butterfly or a complete social outcast. No room for nuance.
No, not with this one.
Okay.
It's like viewing the world in binary code. Either you're a success or you're a failure, right? With no space for all those shades of gray in between.
That sounds exhausting. I can see how that would really impact your self-esteem. What other distortions should we be on the lookout for?
Well, overgeneralization is another big one.
Okay.
Let's say you have, you go to a party and you have a couple of awkward interactions. With overgeneralization, you might just conclude, well, I'm just bad at socializing.
Right. So you're taking a small sample size and applying it to your whole life.
Exactly.
One bad experience doesn't mean you're doomed to be awkward forever.
You got it.
Okay.
And then there's filtering, where you zero in on only the negative aspects of a situation while completely ignoring the positives.
So like if you got feedback on a project and just solely focused on that one criticism
Yeah.
and completely disregarded all the praise.
Absolutely. It's like wearing those, negativity tinted glasses,
Yeah.
blocking out all the good stuff.
Okay. I'm starting to see a pattern here. A lot of these distortions really revolve around that negative self-talk.
You're right.
Many of these distortions, they are rooted in kind of underlying insecurities and negative beliefs about ourselves.
So what's next on our distortion list? What else should we be aware of? We've got magnification and minimization. These are two sides of the same coin, really.
Okay.
Magnification is when you're blowing things out of proportion,
Right.
And minimization is downplaying the significance of something.
So it's like magnifying a small mistake,
Yeah.
minimizing all your accomplishments.
Precisely.
Right.
And this can really throw off your perspective.
Right.
And impact your self-esteem.
Yeah. And speaking of blowing things out of proportion, isn't catastrophizing a form of that?
Yeah, you could say that.
Magnification taken to the extreme.
Catastrophizing is when you just imagine the worst case scenario in every situation, no matter how unlikely it is.
So turning a minor setback into a full-blown disaster in your mind.
Yeah, and it's natural to feel, some anxiety or worry in certain situations.
Right.
But catastrophizing takes those feelings to a whole new level.
Right.
And it can really keep you stuck in this cycle of fear.
This is all starting to sound a bit too familiar, to be honest. I'm already recognizing some of these patterns in my own thinking.
That's great. Awareness is the first step.
Yeah.
Is challenging these distortions. And there are more, we haven't even talked about some of these.
Oh, there are more.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, before we dive into those, I think it's time for a quick word from our sponsor, The 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu.
Welcome back to the 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu.
Right. So before the break, we were talking about all those cognitive distortions, those mental traps
Yeah.
that really warp your perceptions, especially in social situations.
Right.
And you mentioned that there were
Oh, yeah.
even more of these kind of
More to come.
mental gremlins
Yes.
that we haven't even uncovered yet.
Yes.
What's next on our list?
Well, let's talk about should statements.
Should statements, okay.
Yeah, these are those rigid expectations we place on ourselves and on others, often leading to feelings of guilt, frustration, or disappointment when we inevitably fall short.
Oh, I'm so guilty of this one.
Yeah.
Constantly telling myself things like, I should be more outgoing, or
Right.
I should always know the right thing to say, or
Yeah.
it's like I'm just setting myself up for failure
It is.
before I even start.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that life rarely fits neatly into these should boxes.
Right.
These rigid expectations just create this unrealistic standard
Right.
that's often unattainable, and then you just end up feeling all that pressure.
Right.
Self-criticism.
So instead of saying like, oh, I should be more confident,
Yeah.
maybe a better way to approach it is,
Yeah.
I'm working on building my confidence.
Exactly.
Right.
Shifting from these rigid demands to more kind of flexible
Right.
and compassionate goals
Right.
can really make a world of difference
Yeah.
in how you approach, challenges and setbacks.
Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
What's the next distortion we should be on the lookout for?
Let's dive into labeling. This is a close relative of overgeneralization.
Okay.
It's about reducing ourselves or others to a single, often negative label.
Right.
So instead of recognizing, that we all have complex personalities with strengths and weaknesses,
Right.
we just slap on this simplistic label like, I'm a loser,
Right.
or he's a jerk.
Yeah, it's like we're just trying to fit ourselves and everyone else into these
Yeah.
neat little boxes,
Exactly.
which can be incredibly limiting,
Yes.
And
it prevents us from seeing that full picture.
Right.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
Labels can be so constricting
Uh-huh.
for both, our own self-perception and how we view and interact with others.
Yeah, I'm really starting to see how interconnected these distortions are
Right.
and how they kind of stem from that
Yeah.
underlying negative self-image.
Yeah. They do. A lot of these distortions are fueled by those, deep-seated insecurities
Right.
and negative beliefs we hold about ourselves.
Okay. So what's the next distortion on our list?
All right. Let's explore personalization. This is the tendency to assume responsibility for things that are outside our control.
Oh, okay. So like if someone's in a bad mood,
Right.
I automatically assume it's something I did.
That's a classic example of personalization. It can lead to, this whole spiral of self-blame and guilt,
Right.
even when there's no logical reason
Right.
to believe you're the cause
Right.
of someone else's, emotions or actions.
Right. So it's like I'm taking on the weight of the world,
Yeah,
even when it doesn't belong to me.
exactly.
Okay. And you mentioned disqualifying the positive earlier.
Yes.
Tell me more about that one.
This one is especially sneaky
Okay.
because it involves rejecting positive experiences, compliments, or feedback, often by attributing them to these external factors or just downplaying their significance. Okay, so like someone compliments my work and I'm like, oh, they're just being nice, or
Yeah.
anyone could have done that.
Exactly. It's like having this, internal filter that blocks out any positive input.
Right.
So you're just reinforcing that negative self-image we were talking about.
So it's almost like self-sabotage
Yeah.
in a way,
Yeah.
like you're blocking out all those positive reinforcements
Yeah.
that could help you build your self-esteem.
You got it.
Yeah.
And this tendency to disqualify the positive is connected to a broader pattern called attributional style,
Okay.
which is basically how we explain events to ourselves.
Let's break down attributional style.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
It's about how we attribute the causes of events, both good and bad.
Uh-huh.
So people who are prone to disqualifying the positive, they often have kind of a skewed attributional style.
Okay.
They tend to attribute good things to external factors.
Like luck, circumstance, other people,
Yeah.
while attributing bad things to their own, personal flaws or shortcomings.
So it's almost like the opposite of taking credit for your successes.
Right.
Like you're deflecting the positive
Right.
while internalizing all the negative.
Exactly.
It just sounds like a recipe for
Yeah.
feeling pretty lousy about yourself.
It can definitely contribute to that cycle of self-criticism and negativity.
Right.
But here's the fascinating part.
Sorry.
Most people actually have a slightly self-serving bias when it comes to attributions.
Wait, so you're saying it's normal to
Yeah.
to take credit for all the good stuff
Yeah.
and maybe blame external factors for the bad stuff?
To a certain extent, yes.
Really?
It sounds counterintuitive, but a little bit of this self-serving bias can actually be healthy.
Okay.
It helps protect our self-esteem and keeps us motivated.
Wow. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
But for people who disqualify the positive, that self-serving bias is kind of
It's
flipped on its head.
Yeah.
Right.
Instead of having that healthy self-serving bias, they end up with a self-defeating bias.
Right.
They're constantly reinforcing this belief that they're not good enough,
Right.
no matter what they achieve.
That's a really important distinction.
It is.
Okay. So how does all of this relate to, social situations specifically?
Imagine you're at a party, right?
All right.
And you strike up a conversation with someone new.
Mm-hmm.
They seem genuinely interested in what you have to say. The conversation's flowing,
All right.
But if you're prone to disqualifying the positive, you might brush it off as, oh, they're just being polite, or maybe they even pity me.
Right. So instead of just enjoying a positive social interaction,
Right.
you just end up
Yeah.
second-guessing yourself.
Yeah, and missing out on the opportunity to connect.
Right.
And that can lead to, kind of a vicious cycle where you start to avoid social situations altogether.
Yeah, because you just anticipate
Yeah.
those negative interpretations.
Oh. Yeah. Which only reinforces the belief that, you're not good at socializing.
Yeah. This is incredibly insightful. I'm starting to see how these distortions play out, not just in my own life,
Right.
but in the lives of people around me as well.
And that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Awareness is that first crucial step toward breaking free from these patterns. And remember,
Yeah.
it's not about being perfect. It's not about never experiencing these distortions.
Right.
It's about recognizing them when they arise and choosing to challenge them.
So what can our listeners do
Yeah.
to actually start challenging these distortions and kind of create a more positive and realistic
Yeah.
view of themselves and their social interactions?
That's a great question. We'll dive into that right after a quick message from The 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu.
Welcome back to the 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu.
Yes.
We've been kind of exploring all these sneaky cognitive distortions that really mess with our perceptions,
Yeah.
especially in social situations. But now, what can we actually do about them?
Well, the first step is already done.
Right.
You're aware of them.
Right.
And that's huge. Just by recognizing them, you're starting to take back some of their power.
Right. It's like those optical illusions.
Yeah.
Once you see the trick,
You can't unsee it.
yeah, can't unsee it.
Yeah.
So awareness is key.
Mm-hmm.
But what are some practical tools our listeners can use to kind of start challenging these distortions?
Well, one of the most powerful tools is journaling.
Okay.
Take a few minutes each day to just write down your thoughts, feelings, especially in situations where you notices distortions popping up.
Okay, so you're like shining a spotlight on them,
Yes.
bringing them out of the shadows.
Exactly.
Okay.
Would be really helpful.
So by getting those thoughts out of your head and onto paper, you can start to kind of examine them more objectively.
Absolutely. And as you journal, you might start to see these recurring patterns,
Uh-huh.
which can give you, even more insight into your own, unique distortion tendencies.
So once you've identified those patterns, what's the next step? How do you actually go about challenging those negative thoughts?
It's all about asking yourself the right questions.
Okay.
So, when a distorted thought comes up, just pause. Ask yourself, is this thought really true? What evidence do I have to support it? Is there another way of looking at this situation?
Okay. So it's about kind of putting those thoughts on trial,
Exactly.
examining the evidence, seeing if they hold up under scrutiny.
You got it.
And I imagine that could be pretty challenging at first,
It can be. It takes practice.
especially if those negative thought patterns are kind of ingrained for a long time.
But the more you do it, the stronger those mental muscles become. And remember, it's not about instantly transforming into, this relentlessly positive thinker.
Right.
It's about creating a more balanced,
Realistic.
and realistic perspective.
So what about those times when those distortions feel really overwhelming or when they're starting to interfere with your life in a significant way?
Right.
What advice do you have for our listeners who might be struggling with that?
Well, In those cases, seeking professional help is a sign of strength and self-care.
Right.
A therapist can provide you with guidance and support in developing healthier coping mechanisms
Uh-huh.
and challenging those, deeply ingrained negative beliefs.
Right. So it's like having a personal trainer
Yeah,
for your mind,
exactly.
helping you build those mental resilience muscles.
Yeah,
I think it's important to remind our listeners that there's no shame in seeking help. It's actually a sign of
absolutely.
self-awareness
Yeah,
and a commitment to personal growth.
couldn't agree more. And even if you don't feel like you need professional help, there are still things you can do on your own to kind of cultivate a more positive mindset. Surround yourself with supportive people. Engage in activities that bring you joy. Focus on your strengths and accomplishments.
So it's not just about eliminating the negative, but it's also about amplifying the positive,
Yes.
you know, creating a mental environment where those distortions just have less power to take root.
Exactly. It's about building, a more resilient and compassionate relationship with yourself.
This has been a really insightful, deep dive into the world of cognitive distortions. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have too. Any final words of wisdom for our audience before we wrap up?
Just remember, your thoughts are not facts.
Mm-hmm.
They are simply interpretations of reality.
Mm-hmm.
And those interpretations can be flawed.
Right.
But by becoming aware of these common cognitive distortions and practicing, those challenging techniques we talked about, you can start to create a more empowering and authentic experience of yourself
Right.
and the world around you.
Absolutely. So if our thoughts shape our reality, what kind of reality are you creating with yours? That's something to ponder as we wrap up this episode of the 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu. For more insights on personal growth and business success, be sure to visit the 1 Hour Guide website. Thank you for joining us today. Visit the 1 Hour Guide website for more business insights by Anil Nathu.